"Are you even sure they're yours?" my brother asked, halfway through carving the Christmas turkey, in the specific tone he always used when he thought he was being funny. "My name is Michael Bennett. I'm 36 years old. I run marketing for a mid-sized medical device company in Madison, Wisconsin, and until that exact moment, at my parents' dining table, surrounded by string lights and the smell of cinnamon candles Jessica always insisted on for the holidays, I had never once seriously entertained the question my brother had just asked as a joke. I looked at Jessica before I looked at him. That was my first mistake, though I didn't understand it as one yet. I just wanted to see her laugh it off with me, the way we usually handled Danny's terrible jokes, a shared eye roll across the table that had been our language for 8 years of marriage. She didn't laugh. Her face went through something in about a second and a half, a flicker, gone almost as fast as it arrived. But I'd been married to this woman long enough to have a complete inventory of every expression she owned, and this wasn't one of them. This was new. This was a face I hadn't been issued a translation for. "Danny," my mother said, swatting his arm with a dish towel, "don't be crude at the table." Everyone laughed, including Danny, including, a beat too late, Jessica. The moment passed the way moments like that are supposed to pass, dissolved into the general noise of a family dinner, absorbed by mashed potatoes and a 7-year-old asking if he could have pie before the main course. I let it dissolve too. I told myself I'd imagine the flicker on her face, that 8 years of marriage and 2 kids had made me the kind of paranoid husband who read significance into a facial tic that meant nothing at all. I want to tell you that instinct is reliable, that some deep animal part of me registered a threat in that moment, and I acted on it decisively. That's not what happened. What happened is I spent the rest of that Christmas dinner being an entirely normal, entirely oblivious husband and father, laughing at my brother's jokes, refilling my mother's wine glass, watching my daughter Grace fall asleep sitting upright at the table with a piece of pie crust still in her small fist. It took me 3 more weeks to let myself circle back to that flicker on Jessica's face and ask what it had actually been. I need to back up, because none of what happened over those 3 weeks makes sense without understanding where Jessica and I actually stood as a couple by that December. We'd been married 8 years, together for 10, since she was 23 and I was 26, and neither of us had any real idea what building a life with someone actually required. Jessica taught 3rd grade at an elementary school on the east side of Madison, the kind of job people describe as a calling, and in her case, I believed it was one, because I watched her come home exhausted in a way that always somehow still had room for our own kids at the end of the day. I ran marketing for a company that made surgical monitoring equipment, a job that had, over the previous 4 years in particular, eaten increasing chunks of my life in the form of quarterly trade shows, client dinners that ran into the night, and a promotion I'd chased hard enough that I sometimes wonder now what exactly I thought I was building toward. We had Tyler when I was 29, Grace 4 years later. On paper, from the outside, we were exactly the family you'd expect to see at a Christmas table like the one my brother made his joke at. A house in a good school district, 2 kids who mostly got along, a marriage that had weathered the ordinary friction of young parenthood without any of the visible fractures some of our friends' marriages had developed. If you'd asked me, that December, whether Jessica and I were happy, I would have said yes, and I would have meant it, even though some distant, quieter part of me might have added a footnote about the previous 4 years being harder than they should have been, more distance than either of us talked about directly, more nights I came home to a house that had already gone to sleep without me. I didn't know, sitting at that Christmas table with my brother's terrible jokes still faintly ringing in the air, that the distance I'd been vaguely aware of for 4 years had a specific shape and a specific name, and that my own absence during exactly that stretch had left a door open that someone else had, eventually, walked through. I'm telling you this 2 years later, with all the clarity that distance provides and none of the mercy it's supposed to. I've had time to trace every thread back to its actual origin, time to understand which of my own choices had made room for what happened, without that understanding ever once making it hurt less. What I didn't have, standing in my parents' kitchen doing dishes an hour after that dinner, half listening to Jessica laugh at something with my sister-in-law in the next room, was any idea that the woman I'd built a decade of my life around had been carrying a secret heavier than either of our children for going on 8 years, a secret that a genetics kit ordered as a stocking stuffer 3 weeks later, on a whim, for no reason more significant than curiosity about Tyler's freckles, was about to blow open in a way neither of us could take back. Our days ran on the specific, exhausting rhythm of a household with two elementary-aged kids and two full careers. I left for the office by 7:30 most mornings, often before Tyler was even fully awake for school. Jessica handled the morning routine almost entirely: breakfast, backpacks, the specific negotiation required to get Grace into actual clothes rather than the princess costume she wanted to wear to preschool most days. I picked up the slack in the evenings when I could, though when I could, had become an increasingly smaller window over the previous few years as my job's demands stretched later and later into what used to be family time. I want to be honest about my own contribution to the distance in our marriage, because none of what follows makes sense or is fair to Jessica's part in it, without acknowledging mine first. Somewhere around Tyler's third birthday, my company promoted me into a role that came with real advancement, but also real cost. Quarterly trade shows that took me out of state for a week at a time, client relationships that required dinners running late into the evening, a general cultural expectation at that level of the company that face time mattered as much as output. I chased that advancement hard, harder than I probably needed to, telling myself I was building security for our family, when if I'm honest, some real part of it was also about proving something to myself that had nothing to do with Jessica or the kids at all. I was, by nature and by choice, a workaholic, and I let that identity expand to fill space in our marriage that should have belonged to something else. Jessica never made a dramatic issue of it. That's, I think now, part of what let it go on as long as it did. She'd mention, in passing, how long a particular stretch of my travel had been, how Tyler had asked at dinner why Daddy was always at the airport. I'd apologize, mean it in the moment, and then book the same kind of trip 3 weeks later because the job seemed to require it. There was a particular year. Tyler was 4, Grace not yet born, when I was gone, by my own later count, 11 weeks out of 12 consecutive months for a major product launch. I remember being proud of that year professionally. I don't think I ever asked Jessica, directly and seriously, what that year had cost her. The first sign of anything actually wrong, though I filed it away at the time without any real alarm, came that same year, in the fall. Jessica had started going out more with a group of women from her school, book club nights that ran later than book club nights usually run, if you understand what I mean without me needing to say it more plainly. I didn't think much of it. I was gone so often myself that her having her own social outlet seemed, if anything, healthy, a corrective to the isolation my travel schedule was clearly creating. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever built a story in your head about why something is fine, using the exact same evidence that should have told you it wasn't, you understand the particular blindness I'm describing, the specific comfort of an explanation that lets you keep doing exactly what you were already doing without having to change anything at all. There was a specific evening that fall. I remember it because I was actually home for once, a rare unscheduled Thursday, when Jessica came back from one of those book club nights lit up in a way I hadn't seen in longer than I wanted to admit, flushed and talkative and present in a way our ordinary evenings together, by that point, rarely were. I told myself it was good wine and good company. I didn't ask a single follow-up question. I was, at that point in my life, so committed to not being the kind of husband who monitored his wife's evenings out that I'd swung entirely past healthy trust into a kind of willful incuriosity that, looking back now, functioned exactly like permission. Grace was born the following spring, and for a while, the demands of a newborn absorbed enough of both our attentions that whatever had been happening, if anything had been happening at all, seemed to recede. I don't know that for certain. I only know that the book club nights became less frequent once Grace arrived, and that I was too exhausted myself, in that first year of 2 kids, to notice much of anything beyond whether either child had slept through the night. By the time Tyler turned 6, though, a new pattern had emerged that I noticed, filed away, and then explained to myself with the same practiced ease I'd applied to everything else. Jessica had started keeping her phone with her at almost all times, even around the house, a habit shift I registered mostly because it meant I could no longer glance at a text notification the way I sometimes had before, back when her phone lived on the kitchen counter like a piece of ordinary furniture. I asked, once, mildly, why she'd started carrying it everywhere. She said something about a parent in her class who'd been texting her constantly about a difficult situation at home, work matters that required discretion. It was a plausible answer. I accepted it because accepting it required nothing further of me, and by then I had built an entire marriage management style around requiring nothing further of myself. I didn't know it then. This is what she was carrying during exactly that stretch, something she only told me much later, long after any of it could have changed what came next. I told myself, that whole year Tyler was 3, that I wasn't doing anything wrong by just texting him. Old friends stay in touch, I told myself. Ryan and I had history from before Michael, from college, and reconnecting on social media felt harmless the way these things always feel harmless right up until they don't. I remember the specific night it stopped being harmless. Michael had been gone 9 days for a launch event, and I put Tyler to bed alone for the 9th night running, and Ryan called just to check on me. And I cried on the phone with a man I hadn't spoken to in 5 years because he asked me how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. I told myself that conversation didn't count as anything. I believed that for about 6 more weeks. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. By Tyler's 6th birthday, my travel schedule had eased somewhat. The launch cycles that had defined my previous few years had given way to steadier, more predictable work, but the distance between Jessica and me hadn't closed the way I'd assumed it automatically would once I was simply home more. She seemed present with the kids in a way that never fully extended to me, warm in every direction except mine, a pattern I noticed and, characteristically, declined to investigate. The Christmas dinner where my brother made his joke happened when Tyler was 7, which means roughly a year had passed since that phone-carrying habit had settled into something permanent, unremarked upon, simply part of the furniture of our marriage. I want to walk through what actually happened in the 3 weeks between that dinner and the moment everything broke open, because it's in those 3 weeks that the suspicion I'd been avoiding for years finally became impossible to keep avoiding. The genetics kit was, genuinely, an impulse purchase, a novelty gift I'd ordered online in early January, thinking Tyler would get a kick out of learning about his ancestry for a school project on family history, the kind of thing 7-year-olds get assigned and parents end up doing half the research for. I ordered one for myself too, mostly as an afterthought, curious in an idle way about my own background that I'd never bothered investigating. I didn't think about my brother's Christmas comment when I placed the order. I want to be honest that the two things weren't consciously connected in my mind at all. What connected them, eventually, was Jessica's reaction when the kits arrived. She was, from the moment the box showed up on our porch, visibly unsettled in a way that took me several days to fully register as unusual rather than simply distracted. She suggested, almost immediately, that maybe we should wait on the kits, that she'd read something about data privacy concerns with these companies, that Tyler's school project deadline wasn't for another month anyway, no rush. I noted the suggestion and, following 8 years of established habit, didn't push back on it. The kits sat unopened on our kitchen counter for nearly 2 weeks. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever watched someone you love find increasingly specific reasons to delay something ordinary, and told yourself each reason was reasonable on its own, even as the pattern itself should have told you everything, you already understand exactly what those 2 weeks felt like from where I was standing, half noticing something I still wasn't ready to name. During those 2 weeks, small behavioral things accumulated that I noticed individually and dismissed individually, the way I'd trained myself to do for years. Jessica brought up, twice, unprompted, how much Tyler's laugh reminded her of her own father, a comment that would have meant nothing except that she'd never made it before in 7 years of Tyler's life, and made it twice within 1 week specifically after the kits arrived. She started, that same stretch, taking noticeably longer to respond to texts I sent during the day, a small delay I registered without understanding what she might have been doing with those missing minutes. I finally opened my own kit on a Saturday afternoon in late January, mostly out of boredom, spitting into the little tube while Grace narrated the process to her stuffed animals in a tone of great scientific importance. I mentioned, casually, that I'd finally done mine and asked when Tyler wanted to do his for the school project. Jessica's response, a too quick, too bright, we have plenty of time, was the first moment I actually let myself register that something in her behavior didn't add up to the reasonable, distracted mom explanation I'd been supplying for 2 weeks. I asked her directly, that evening, after the kids were in bed, whether something was bothering her about the kits specifically. She said no, laughed it off, said she was probably overthinking the privacy concerns she'd mentioned before. I let it go, again, because letting things go was, by that point in my life, closer to a reflex than a decision. I didn't know it then. This is what was happening inside her that same evening, something she carried alone for 3 more weeks before either of us said anything real to each other about it. I sat on the edge of our bed after Michael fell asleep, and I thought, very clearly, about telling him everything right then. I had the actual words in my head. I know exactly what I would have said. I didn't say them because I was terrified, not of losing him exactly, though that terrified me too, but of what it would mean for Tyler specifically, for the shape of his whole life, if the truth came out in a way I could control instead of a way I couldn't. I told myself I needed more time to figure out how to say it right. I'd been telling myself some version of that for 7 years by then. I don't think I actually believed, that night, that there was a right way left to say it at all. I think I just needed one more night of not having said it yet. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. The kids went back and forth in conversation for another 2 weeks without resolution, a stalling pattern that, in hindsight, I understand now as Jessica trying to find some way to intercept the results before I saw them, or perhaps trying to find the courage to tell me herself before a lab report did it for her. Neither happened. Tyler's school project deadline finally arrived in mid-February, and Jessica, out of options and unable to delay any further without raising more direct questions than she was willing to answer, submitted both kits together. The results came back over a period of about 10 days, arriving by email as the various companies processed different aspects of the analysis. Ancestry composition first, health markers a few days later, and then, almost as an afterthought in the interface, a section neither of us had specifically requested, but that the service included automatically, relative matching, designed to connect users with genetic relatives who'd also used the platform. It was Tyler's report that flagged it first, not mine. A notification that a close family member match had been found in the database, someone the algorithm estimated as a likely paternal uncle or half-sibling. A person whose profile name I didn't recognize at all. I remember staring at that notification for a long time before I understood what it was actually telling me. My own report, when I checked it against Tyler's shared results a few minutes later, showed no such connection to that unfamiliar name. But more importantly, showed something the interface displayed in language so clinical it took me a second read to absorb its full weight. Tyler's report indicated a shared DNA percentage with me consistent with an uncle or grandfather relationship, not a father. I sat with my laptop open in my home office for what must have been 40 minutes before I moved at all. I didn't cry, not yet. I felt, more than anything, a strange, cold precision settle over me. The same feeling I get at work when a project has clearly gone wrong, and the only useful next step is figuring out exactly how and why, methodically, before deciding what to do about it. I want to be honest about the mistake I made in that stretch of time, because I don't want to tell this story as though I handled every part of it well. Instead of confronting Jessica immediately, I spent 6 days quietly building a case, the way I might build a marketing analysis for work, cross-referencing dates, pulling old calendar entries, going back through years of photos looking for a face I might have overlooked, a name I might have dismissed. 6 days of coming home, eating dinner across the table from my wife, helping Tyler with his homework, tucking Grace in, saying absolutely nothing about the report sitting open in a browser tab on my laptop. The unfamiliar name from Tyler's match notification led me, after some searching, to a public profile, a man named Ryan Castellano, a name that meant nothing to me until I found, buried in an old photo album from Jessica's college years that she'd shared with me once, years earlier, as part of getting to know each other's pasts, a photograph of Jessica at maybe 22, arm around a young man whose face, once I really looked, matched the profile photo I'd just found almost exactly. I found other things during those 6 days too, pieces that on their own might have meant nothing, but that together built a picture I could no longer avoid. A folder of old emails, still technically accessible through a shared family cloud backup neither of us had bothered to fully separate, containing a handful of messages between Jessica and this same Ryan Castellano, dated to the exact stretch of years I now understood to be relevant. Messages that weren't explicit, weren't even particularly incriminating on their own, but that carried an unmistakable warmth and familiarity that told me everything the actual words didn't need to say directly. There were false leads in that search too, moments where I nearly convinced myself of something that turned out to be nothing. A charge on an old credit card statement for a hotel near Jessica's college town, dated years back, that alarmed me for a full day before I remembered it coincided with her college roommate's wedding, an event I'd actually attended myself. A deleted contact in her phone that I spent an evening trying to recover, convinced it would be the key piece of evidence, before discovering it belonged to an old dentist's office that had simply closed down. Both leads cost me real anxiety before dissolving into nothing, and I understand now that I needed those false alarms almost as much as I needed the real evidence. They let me keep investigating without arriving. Yet, at the conclusion, some part of me had already reached the moment I read Tyler's report, and simply wasn't ready to say out loud. Looking back now, I understand the real reason Jessica stalled the genetics kits for 2 full weeks. The real reason she brought up her own father's laugh out of nowhere right after the box arrived. The real reason a stretch of book club nights 9 years ago had left her lit up in a way our ordinary evenings never quite matched. Every one of those details had been sitting in plain view for years. I simply hadn't wanted the version of my own life that seeing them clearly would have required me to live inside. By the end of that 6th day, I had what I needed. The report itself, the photograph, the old emails, a timeline that stretched back to a period 9 years earlier when I'd been gone 11 weeks out of 12 for a product launch I'd once been proud of. I confronted her that Friday evening, the same day my brother had, months earlier, made a joke at Christmas dinner without any idea how close to accurate it actually was. I didn't plan to confront her calmly. I want to say that plainly, because I'd spent 6 days telling myself I would handle this the way I handled difficult conversations at work, methodically, evenly, evidence laid out in order. That plan lasted about as long as it took Jessica to walk into the kitchen and see my laptop open on the table, the report visible, the old photograph printed and sitting beside it. "Tyler's not mine," I said. Not a question. I watched something in her face collapse and harden at the same time, both happening at once in a way I'd never seen on her before. What followed wasn't the interrogation I'd rehearsed in my head over 6 sleepless nights. It was something closer to a full eruption from both of us at once. Years of unspoken resentment surfacing together with the specific betrayal I'd just laid on the table between us. I raised my voice in a way I hadn't in the entire 8 years of our marriage. Years of things I'd swallowed rather than said coming out all at once, tangled up with the immediate wound of Tyler's report. She matched me almost instantly, her own voice climbing, deflecting first. "You were never home. Michael, you have no right to stand there and act like the wrong party when you were gone 11 weeks that year." And then pivoting into open anger, old grievances about my travel schedule and my absence flooding into the same conversation as the affair itself, until the two things became almost indistinguishable from each other. Each of us using the other's failure to justify our own. "How long?" I said, my voice cracking on the second word. "How long did you know?" "Since before he was born," she said, and something in the flatness of that admission landed harder than any of the shouting had. "I've known his whole life, Michael. Every single day of his whole life." That admission didn't quiet either of us. If anything, it escalated things further, her voice rising into something closer to rage than defense, mine matching it. Both of us saying things across that kitchen that 8 years of marriage should have made unthinkable to say to each other. She brought up my father's own history, a difficult period years before Tyler when my own workaholic patterns had first started to calcify, throwing it at me as though it explained or excused what she'd done. I brought up every one of those book club nights, every late text response, 9 years of small, unexplained absences I'd cataloged without ever confronting until this exact moment, all of it coming out at once, unfiltered, in an order that made no logical sense, but carried every bit of the accumulated weight. We only stopped, both of us, at almost exactly the same instant, when a small voice from the hallway said, "Mommy? Daddy? Why are you yelling?" Tyler stood in the doorway of the kitchen in his pajamas, 7 years old, clearly woken by noise that had carried further through our house than either of us, in the heat of it, had accounted for. The silence that followed his question was more complete than anything either of us had managed to say in the previous 20 minutes combined. Jessica reached him first, kneeling down, telling him everything was fine, that mommy and daddy were just having a grown-up disagreement, walking him back toward his room with a steadiness in her voice that I understood, even in that moment, must have cost her everything she had left. I stood alone in the kitchen once she'd gone, my hands shaking, adrenaline draining out of me in a way that left me feeling almost hollowed out rather than relieved. When Jessica came back downstairs several minutes later, neither of us said anything else that night. The fight had burned itself out the moment our son's voice interrupted it, and whatever came next would have to happen without an audience. She finally spoke, 2 days later, once the kids were at school and something had settled enough between us for actual words to be possible. This is what she told me. It started 9 years ago, the fall you were gone 11 weeks for the launch. I don't have some excuse that makes it smaller than it was. Ryan reached out through an old college friend group online, and I told myself reconnecting was harmless because we had genuine history, because talking to him felt like remembering a version of myself that existed before I became someone managing a house alone most nights. The first time we actually met in person, I told myself it was just coffee, just two old friends catching up. I believed that until I didn't anymore, and by then it had already gone further than coffee. I found out I was pregnant with Tyler about 6 weeks after the one time anything physical happened between us, and I did the math immediately, privately, and I knew. I told myself, that whole pregnancy, that it didn't matter which man's genes he carried, that I would love him exactly the same either way, and I have, every single day, but I also knew I was building our entire family on top of something I never told you. I was terrified constantly of losing you, of losing Tyler if the truth ever came out, of what it would mean for Grace to grow up in a family that shattered because of something that happened before she was even born. There were nights I couldn't look at his baby pictures without feeling sick. I never found a moment I thought I could survive telling you the truth in. I kept choosing silence because every day that passed made the silence feel like the only choice left. I didn't say anything for a long time after she finished. Some of what she'd said matched, almost exactly, the version I'd already pieced together during those 6 days alone with my laptop. Some of it, the specific ache in her voice when she talked about my absence, the genuine terror about Grace, landed in a way I hadn't expected and didn't fully want to feel. I filed for divorce 3 weeks after that conversation, once the immediate shock had settled into something more like resolve. There was no serious attempt at reconciliation between us. The fight that Tyler had interrupted had already burned through whatever bridge might have existed, and Jessica, to her credit, didn't fight the decision or ask for more time than the situation reasonably required. The scandal, when it came exactly the way these things do in a city the size of Madison, through channels neither of us controlled. My brother, still unaware of the actual weight his Christmas joke had carried, mentioned the DNA test results to our mother during an unrelated conversation about family ancestry projects, not realizing what he was disclosing. Word moved from there through the extended family, then, inevitably, into the smaller overlapping circles of Jessica's school and my own social network, until what had happened in our kitchen became, within a couple of months, something people at PTA meetings and neighborhood gatherings referenced in careful, lowered voices when they thought no one who mattered was listening. I won't pretend that part didn't cost Jessica dearly. Several parents at Tyler's school treated her with a coldness that had nothing to do with her actual teaching, and 2 friendships she'd maintained for over a decade quietly dissolved once the full story became common knowledge. The consequences, once the divorce proceedings concluded, were concrete rather than merely social. Given the circumstances a judge considered relevant, the 8-year concealment, the deliberate delay with the genetics kits that a forensic accountant working the case flagged as evidence of intentional obstruction, I was awarded primary custody of both children and the family home, along with a settlement that reflected the court's plain acknowledgement of where the fault in the marriage's collapse actually lay. Ryan Castellano, for his part, had by then built a life of his own 2 states away, married with children of his own. When the truth surfaced, and eventually reached his own family through the same small world channels that had exposed everything to mine, his marriage did not survive the disclosure either, a consequence I learned about secondhand and took no particular satisfaction in. I want to be honest about something complicated here, because this story doesn't resolve as cleanly as a simple villain and victim account would suggest. Tyler is still my son in every way that has ever mattered day to day. I raised him from his first breath in a lab report. However much it upended my understanding of the previous 7 years, didn't change a single thing about who he is to me or who I am to him. I made that clear to him, gently, in an age-appropriate conversation months later, though not the full details. Simply that mommy and daddy loved him exactly the same as always, and that some grown-up things had happened that weren't his fault at all. He didn't need to carry the weight of what the adults around him had done. I got both kids full-time, with Jessica maintaining regular scheduled visitation that, over the 2 years since, has settled into something workable, if never fully comfortable. I understand, in a way I couldn't have before any of this happened, that my own 11 weeks and 12 months year, and the several years of diminished presence that followed it, created exactly the kind of isolation that made Jessica's choices, if not forgivable, at least explicable in a way that matters to how I've processed the whole thing since. I don't say that to excuse 8 years of concealment. I say it because pretending I bore no responsibility for the conditions that made her choice possible would be its own kind of dishonesty, and I've had enough dishonesty in this story already without adding my own. Tyler is 9 now, still funny in the specific way that used to remind me, before I knew any different, of my own father. Last week he asked me, out of nowhere, why Uncle Danny doesn't come to Christmas anymore. I told him Uncle Danny and I were working through some things, which was true enough for a 9-year-old to hold on to, and which spared him the fuller truth, that I haven't been able to look at my brother the same way since that dinner, not because his joke caused any of what came after it, but because it forced open a door that might otherwise have stayed shut for years longer, and some part of me, unfairly perhaps, has never fully forgiven him for the timing of it, even as I understand he couldn't have known. I understood, somewhere in the 2 years since that Christmas dinner, that my own workaholic patterns hadn't been the neutral, admirable ambition I'd told myself they were for most of a decade. They'd been a slow withdrawal from the actual work of a marriage, disguised as devotion to providing for it. I paid for that withdrawal in a currency I never expected. Not lost income or lost time, but 8 years of not knowing who my own son's father actually was, a fact that had been sitting, unspoken, across the dinner table for me for longer than I want to fully sit with. What still catches me, 2 years later, isn't really the affair itself, or even the 8 years of concealment that followed it. It's how completely both of those things grew out of the exact same soil, one that I helped till without ever intending to. I spent years believing my absence and Jessica's silence were 2 separate failures happening in the same house. They weren't. My 11 weeks away built the loneliness that made Ryan's attention feel like oxygen. Her silence afterward protected a version of our family I never knew was already compromised, and my own incuriosity, my long habit of accepting easy explanations rather than asking harder questions, gave that silence 8 full years of undisturbed cover to operate inside. There's a version of this story where I get to be simply the wronged party, and there's real truth in that version. Jessica made choices over 8 years that caused profound harm, and no accounting of my own failures erases her responsibility for those choices. But the version of the story that actually helps me understand what happened, rather than just grieve it, requires holding both truths simultaneously. That she deceived me for the better part of a decade, and that I built, through years of chosen absence, exactly the kind of marriage where a deception like that could survive undetected for that long. Neither truth cancels the other out. Both of them are simply, uncomfortably, true. The alternative path haunts me sometimes, the way these things do. What would have happened if I'd asked one real, direct question during that fall 9 years ago, instead of accepting every explanation Jessica offered without examination? I don't know if she'd have told me the truth then. I don't know if I'd have believed her. But I understand now that the habit of not asking cost me something I can never fully get back, regardless of what asking might have revealed at the time. If there's one thing I keep coming back to, sitting with this story 2 years out, it's that the truth doesn't actually wait for a convenient moment to surface. It waited 9 years in my case, sitting quietly under the surface of ordinary dinners and school projects and a brother's careless joke, until a novelty gift meant for a school assignment cracked it open in a kitchen on an ordinary Friday night. I don't think Jessica was a monster for the silence she kept. I think she was a frightened woman who made one choice 9 years ago, and then spent nearly a decade unable to find a door back out of it. That understanding doesn't undo the damage. It just makes the damage make sense. Have you ever found out that the ground you'd been standing on for years wasn't quite what you thought it was? I think more people carry some version of that discovery than ever talk about it out loud. If this reminded you of a truth you found out later than you wish you had, or a question you never quite let yourself ask, I'd like to hear it. Drop one word in the comments, the moment or the person that taught you what you'd been avoiding all along. Thank you for staying with this one. Some stories take longer to make peace with than others, and I'm still, honestly, working on this one.